Good evening. Thank you all for joining us this evening for a briefing on recent events in Israel. Today, we are pleased to host Mr. David Wurmser. David served as the Middle East advisor to former US Vice President Dick Cheney and as a special assistant to John Bolton, the former National Security Advisor of the United States. We will discuss today how President Biden and Prime Minister Sunak's visit to Israel reveal a common goal in countering Hamas, with implications extending beyond Gaza. As we all see, this conflict is reshaping the region's landscape and global dynamics. We will delve into the complexities of the emerging alliances and their impact on Israel and the regional partnerships. We also will attempt to assess various war scenarios and their implications for the Middle East geopolitical landscape and global significance. This webinar is part of StandWithUs UK's efforts to educate and provide essential information about Israel. On an ongoing basis, and especially in the last 2 weeks, StandWithUs UK have invested all its efforts in combating anti-Semitism and misinformation about Israel. Our programs are delivered in schools, campuses, synagogues, and community centers for both Jews and non-Jews. In light of recent events, we have opened a special Israel support center where you can access campus information packages for students, to book sessions for your community or school, and receive live updates. I invite you to follow us on social media platforms and support our efforts to share credible and accurate information, especially in these challenging times. I hope you will find this evening interesting, and already now I invite you to join our next webinar next Thursday, same hour, with Miri Eisen, former media advisor to Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Olmert during the Second Lebanon War. I'm sure it will be fascinating. For any of our guests who have questions for David, please post it in the Q&A at the bottom of your screen, and we will choose some towards the end of this briefing. David is currently in Tel Aviv, so if an alarm sounds, he will need to go to shelter. Please bear with us. It should not take more than 4 or 5 minutes, we hope. Apologies in advance. Now we can start. David, thank you very much for joining us tonight.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's a great honor being with you, and we've worked together wonderfully before, and it was a great honor then, and it's a great honor to work with StandWithUs here. It's a wonderful organization. I see stuff they do in the United States, not in Britain, and it's really the front line of what's really one of the more difficult fronts that Israel faces, which is to explain itself, frankly, to explain reality and explain truth. So I really appreciate what StandWithUs does.
Thank you very much, David. Absolutely. Let's start with the first question. We all know that what happened on Saturday, October 7th, goes beyond the conflict between Israel and Hamas. The shockwaves of this event are being felt worldwide in Western capitals, Arab nations, the Gulf states, and obviously Iran. It's almost hard to remember, but just 3 weeks ago, we were discussing the possibility of normalization between Israel and Saudi Arabia as part of the Abraham Accords. Now, looking at the big picture, what do you think about the global impact and the current situation, especially how these new alliances between Israel and the Arab countries under the Abraham Accords are changing things in the Middle East?
Well, sure, and I think it may actually be one of the origins of this right now. Really, when you look at the Middle East, you have to look at it as a strategic competition between Israel, Iran, and more largely a bloc. I mean, you had yesterday the Chinese leader, Xi, and Putin meet, and they declared that they're establishing a new world order. And Iran, of course, there's an axis that goes from Pyongyang all the way over to Rafah in the Gaza Strip. That's essentially, it's a block of nations that represent a challenge to the West, even a threat to the West. So in a certain sense, what's happening in the Middle East is part of a much larger picture. And Israel, being the front line of the West in the region, certainly is unfortunately one of the first to feel it very strongly. And that, I think, in a really basic way is what's happening here. It's true we can debate whether Iran, and there are analysts who say that Iran didn't quite want Hamas to do what it did when it did it. But I think it's irrelevant because they trained Hamas to do this. They've trained Hezbollah to do a similar thing in the north. So whether the timing might not have been quite what Iran wanted, or whether they gave the direct order, strategically, Iran has prepared for this attack for quite some time. So essentially, this is an attack, and you wonder why. The first question is the Arab countries. Israel was in an advanced state of negotiations with Saudi Arabia for peace. It already had peace with the Abraham Accord countries. And I think Iran began to feel isolated, and it began to become a strategic problem for Iran. It began to understand that the future of the Middle East was slowly taking shape in front of its eyes. And that future was the UAE contiguously all the way over to Israel with trade, transportation, cultural ties, and so forth. Truly, revolutionary change in the Middle East was taking shape. And of course, strategically for the Iranians, this was not good. So I think on one level, the war that was launched by Hamas is designed to derail those negotiations and hopefully for them to derail peace. On the second level, it wanted to show that Israel is weak. They've been saying for years that Israel is a kura kavish, which is a spider's web. You pull at one of the web's strings and the whole thing just collapses. It doesn't have any real mass. And they say Israel is that. So they by this attack essentially try to establish that Israel is not a valid country. It's actually quite a fragile country and can easily be destroyed. And then finally, I think they understood, and I think this applies to the world as a whole, that the United States, its power was eroding. It was eroding because partly some didn't want more wars, endless wars. There was a certain isolationism. On the other side, there was some who said American power is not a force for good, the far left, for example. So I think you started having this perception out there, justified or not, we can talk about, that the West was beginning to withdraw from the Middle East. And also, the West had gotten into fights with some of its allies, like Saudi Arabia. The first year or two of the Biden administration's term was quite unsteady with Saudi Arabia. The Saudi Arabian government felt that the Biden administration was frankly trying to get them ousted. So if you take all that, there was also a climate of Western erosion. And since the entire security architecture of the region, frankly, even the entire security architecture of the world, is anchored to American power, that erosion of American power invited challenge to the stability in the system. And of course, Israel being where it is, being at the center of the Middle East, moving forward to establishing a powerful structure of nations at peace with each other, this became one of the focal points of attack to challenge that the world order based on American power since World War II. But it's again part of a larger picture. So in a very sort of contextual way, that leads me to believe that's why the Iranians did this attack. Now, why now? First of all, on some level, the Saudi Arabian-Israeli peace talks probably were a trigger. But also something I would worry about, and I have no solid evidence on this, but just simply experience having been in the US government dealing with the Iran portfolio at critical periods in the past. Iran tends to do lateral destabilization when it lurches forward in its nuclear program and crosses what others have said were red lines. So in 2006, they were within the framework of the Paris Accords, and they wanted to violate the Paris Accords, so they did. So that the West was beginning to react, and we were negotiating with the Russians, actually, at that time, to try to get a UN resolution that's legally binding to sanction Iran for having violated the Paris Accords, which they were barred from any research activity on their nuclear program, and they introduced inert gas, but gas into their centrifuges to test them. So it was very clear that this was April, May. Larijani then went straight from London, where he basically told the British, to hell with you, essentially. He flew straight to Beirut, and 2 days later, they kidnapped the Israeli soldiers that triggered the 2006 war. And within a week, everybody was focused on that war and not the Iranian nuclear program. So there is a history of Iran diverting attention away from the nuclear program while it lurches forward by launching a regional destabilization action or a war even. So while I don't have any specific evidence that's the case, it's one of those things, having dealt with the Iranians for 10 to 15 years, I would be very attentive to that. Now, will this war work for for the Iranians? This really depends entirely on how the Israelis prosecute the war. Obviously, if the point was to make the point that Israel is not a strong horse that's worth making peace with and worth for the West to anchor its strategic power to in the region, if it's not a strong horse, but instead a lame mule, then Israel has to emerge from this with a strategic victory, not a victory in the confines of the Hamas-Israel struggle or even the Israeli-Palestinian question. It has to be a victory that has geostrategic implications in the region in order to overturn this image of Israel limping and now damaged and weak and going down. So it's actually a major strategic interest for the United States, and I think it would be the Arab countries in the region are very intent on Israel winning.
David, when we are listening to the rhetoric that comes from Jerusalem, mainly after the visit of President Biden, it seems like that the Israelis are focusing on Hamas. And you mentioned, and I absolutely agree with you, that the bigger problem is Iran, and not only Hamas, Iran itself, but also its proxies in the region, and mainly Hezbollah. So obviously, if Israel will go and be focused on Hamas, it is not going to solve the problem. One might ask if it is impossible to eliminate Hamas completely, which also holds branches in other countries around the world, meaning, dealing with them in Gaza doesn't mean that we dealt with them in other countries around the world. So what do you think that eventually the approach that Israel will take in this war? Will it go on Hamas, hoping to end it up with eliminating Hamas, or we are looking at something wider than that, maybe Iran, maybe Hezbollah, other fronts?
Well, no, it's these are excellent questions. I think at the end, what Hamas is Israel has to focus on Hamas on one level, whether it's first, last, alone. It has to essentially. The mafia don Iran has sent a hitman to kill Israel, to kill somebody. The first thing you have to do is kill the killer. Now, you're absolutely right. Hamas has a presence in the West Bank, Judea and Samaria. It has a presence in Lebanon. It has a presence in Qatar. It has a presence in Turkey. Certainly has a presence in Syria. Israel can deal perhaps with Gaza, and it can deal with perhaps even destroying it, although from what I'm hearing, that would take reoccupation, at least for some period. It's not the sort of thing you go in and then a week later you leave. The cleaning out operation could be months after occupation. But Israel, I think, focused in its rhetoric on Hamas because at the end, where you see the United States, now this may be changing as we speak because the Al-Assad air base in Syria and Iraq has just been hit by drones. The American air base, obviously coming from Iranian militias, and something was happening down in the Red Sea just now, where some missiles were just shot down coming out of Yemen. I don't know if they were headed towards Israel or whether they were headed toward an American ship, but apparently they've been shot down. But at any rate, so there's that. But rhetorically, up until right now, the big question is, obviously, the United States and Israel, and for that matter, Britain and Israel, and even Germany and Israel, seem to be eye to eye in how they understand it. But the question is, are these two lines that are intersecting, and we're at that point of intersection, or are these two lines that never quite touch but are running in parallel quite closely to each other? The difference is you may have a point of intersection, but then the lines diverge. And the point of intersection right now is everybody wants to get rid of Hamas. Israel, because it has understood that its security concept has collapsed, deterrence of Hamas doesn't work, but I think even more than that, that it cannot allow threats to build so close to its borders. So this can have implications for how it will look at the PLO and the Palestinian Authority, and certainly Hezbollah down road, that they can't wait for somebody to attack them and they can't let them build up. They have to proactively take down these threats. So that's Israel. But the United States is still, I think, with the paradigm that, okay, you get rid of Hamas, you need an exit strategy. An exit strategy is, we've also been worried about Hamas, and we've been worried about Hamas in the West Bank. So, this actually kills two birds with one stone. You solve Gaza, but you also solve the problem of Abu Mazen. It takes away his biggest opponent, which means you could also bring Abu Mazen finally back into Gaza, and the two-state solution is back on track. So that's the American view, at least was up until right now. And that means that Israel right now is in a state of convergence. But once Hamas is dealt with, you can start seeing again certain tensions. I think that's the case even with Iran. Now, again, if the Houthis were attacking an American ship and Iran just attacked an American base, it may change things. But I think the Americans still are in a different paradigm than Israel. When Israel was hit by Hamas, Israelis do understand that's Iran, that's the head of the octopus. So while they may deal with Hamas first, or they may deal with Hamas now and then prepare for another attack from Hezbollah and use that, or if they attack Hezbollah first, and there are a lot of voices who are calling for that, by the way, to attack Hezbollah first and put a holding pattern on Gaza and then circle back. And there are even voices calling for a direct assault on, at least symbolically, on Iran as well. So the United States isn't there. The United States still believes in the paradigm, as far as I can tell, that there are moderates and hardliners in Iran. Right now, the hardliners seem to have the upper hand, and Iran is misbehaving, and it's making it tough to come up with a new nuclear deal. But there's a belief that if you push it too far with the Iranians, you validate the hardliners, and you knock out the moderates. And the whole goal of American policy is to try to show the Iranians, we want to come to a deal with you. The moderates need to be validated. We need to have the hardliners put into a corner, and sort of to trying to encourage and build up the moderates so that you can come up with a nuclear deal. But now, with what's just happened with Iranian proxies, I think the American mindset, ironically, the Israelis are moving toward a more direct confrontation with Iran. I think the United States, while it looks like it's heading for a direct confrontation with Iran by its threats of deterrence and we will strike you, don't do it, blah, 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 deep down, the Americans still believe, with the right circumstances, there's a deal to be had with Iran. And moreover, now there's a possibility of a deal with Iran that involves a deal with Iran that involves also a larger regional understanding beyond the nuclear portfolio that might include missiles, might include also the regional terrorist and security environment and so forth. So again, another area where I see lines of intersection that afterwards can diverge. On the other hand, reality can take over, and that can change things. But I'll leave it at that. But we can get into it in more depth.
While we are talking, I just saw a report in one of Israel's news channel that the Israelis assessed that the missiles fired from Yemen were aimed to southern Israel and not to the Red Sea, which is a significant thing, and we'll see how things will develop. So I would like to continue our conversation, and you mentioned deterrence. Obviously what happened on Saturday eroded or almost killed Israel deterrence in the region. And we saw the Americans involving immediately, sending battle groups to the Mediterranean. President Biden was here, Secretary Blinken were here, and they're not just visiting, they took an active part in the war cabinet, which is, I think, something unprecedented, really like participating and involving in the preparation for war. And my question to you is, how long you think Israel will be able to continue to rely on the Americans when it comes to its national security?
Well, I don't think Israel can rely on the Americans for its national security. I don't believe that the United States really is offering Israel to intervene in a Hezbollah-Israeli war, the Hamas-Israeli war. You know, there may be a Patriot battery where, like in 1991, the first Iraq war, the United States deployed Patriots to help defend Israeli homeland defense. You could see something like that because Israel really is potentially facing an overwhelming amount of missiles. You might also see, because there are American hostages and there are British hostages and there are German hostages, there are international hostages now in Gaza. Well, there are the citizens of the United States, and it is fair game for the United States to try to save its citizens. So you could see some cooperation even on the commando level if there's some realistic possibility for freeing hostages. But overall, these wars are Israel's to fight. The American position toward Iran is not to fight Iran, it's to deter Iran so that they keep the stability of the region and calm it down. So the deterrence isn't meant to threaten Iran as an enemy, it's meant to threaten Iran so that we can come to terms with Iran afterwards, and that they don't do something that breaks the dishes and forces America's hand and forces the situation to spin out of control where everybody has to react to Iran. Again, with these missiles coming from the Houthis, we're getting awfully close to that being untenable. But nevertheless, I still think that's the American position toward deterrence. And it's not, I think, fully grasped in Israel. I think the Israelis think the mood here is a much greater confluence of interests that run in parallel and will continue to run in parallel. But now America understands the axis of evil that Israel faces. America's on board. It no longer has any illusions about Iran. I'm not sure that's true, and I think the coming weeks may bear that out. But that said, reality takes over, war takes its course, and hands will be forced. So I actually think in the long run, I'm dubious that this can be contained. Nor do I think necessarily Israel will only focus on Hamas. I think it focused rhetorically on Hamas because that's the area of agreement with America. There's no agreement on a preemptive strike against Hezbollah in a broader war. So the Israelis weren't going to say that rhetorically. But I'm not sure it's going to stay contained. One, because maybe Israel will act differently. Two, I don't see Hezbollah sitting on its hands while Israel goes into Gaza full force. So I think this will unfortunately escalate.
So it will be fair to assess that we are heading to a multi-front war based on Israel interest in Lebanon, based on what we saw from Yemen tonight, and like the overall atmosphere of this conflict.
I believe so. I believe we are facing a situation like that. I believe one of the things that led Israel to believe it had deterrence against Hamas, which collapsed, is the same thing that they have vis-a-vis Hezbollah. And that's why I'm not confident that it's going to stay quiet. Well, it's not quiet. They're shooting across the border. There's missiles. There's gunfire, anti-tank. Several Israeli soldiers have been killed. Several Hezbollahis have been killed. This is a hot front, but it's still a contained front. To burst out, the assumption the Israelis seem to still carry with the North, or at least some. I'm not sure the Israeli military does or the Israeli government does, but some of the chattering classes who are close to intelligence, former intelligence chiefs, they still believe in deterrence vis-a-vis Hezbollah. And the reason why deterrence failed with Hamas and why I think it probably will fail with Hezbollah is it's based on an understanding that these are independent organizations with independent interests. And as a result, suicide doesn't make any sense. And what Hamas did is suicide. Taking 200 hostages, killing 1,500 Israelis. And frankly, the plan that seems to be now on being discovered was for a much more extensive attack. It actually failed on some level due to the bravery of Israeli soldiers. They fought to the death on the line, literally fought to the death. And they stopped the terrorists within 4 to 5 kilometers. And the line stabilized and it was pushed back. There were a few squads that got all the way to Fakim, 25 kilometers in. But by and large, the front line stopped 5 kilometers in. Sderot, only part of it fell. 37,000 people live in Sderot. And you can only imagine the death toll if that city had fallen. And then the plan was to punch through north and start heading toward linking up with the West Bank. And then there was a seaborne attack that was being planned somewhere up the coast, whether it's Ashkelon, Ashdod, or Tel Aviv itself, we don't know. But the Navy did what it had to do. So as horrible as it was, the IDF literally fought against all odds, to stop this invasion where it stopped it from what could have been a much worse. The much worse tells you there's no way Hamas couldn't have expected Israel to come back at it with everything it has. So it's kind of suicide. And I think that tells you the strategic situation right there. You have, everybody understands a suicide bomber, and you can't deter a suicide bomber. I mean, he's coming in and he's committing suicide. You can only stop a suicide bomber. You can't deter him. I think we have to understand Hamas as a suicide, or at least that part of Hamas that did it, as a suicide organization, like a suicide bomber, serving the interests of the larger strategic organization, which is Iran. So as the parallel between the suicide bomber and Hamas is the parallel between Hamas and Iran. There was this debate as well in 2006, and it's been almost 20 years. It's been about 16, 17 years since then. So I don't think I'm divulging too many state secrets in this. But there were communications between Hezbollah and Iran before the war, where Hezbollah was basically saying, be careful. These Israelis are pretty darn dangerous. And Iran said, look, the UN just kicked Syria out of Lebanon, and you guys are in horrible political trouble. If you think by sort of husbanding your power, trying to reestablish yourself, you're going to be able to resurrect yourself in Lebanon, you're kidding yourself. You are done as an organization. You are finished. Your era is over, unless you deliver a regional victory to Iran. Now, you may suffer a lot, but a regional victory that appears to be an Iranian success will so change the strategic momentum in the region that you, as a local representative of Iran, will derive strength from that. And from that, you will be able to resurrect yourself. And Syria will be able to resurrect itself and reassert its control over Lebanon. So again, I would look at Hezbollah in that way. It is an extension of Iranian strategic power, the way Hamas was an extension of Iranian strategic power. And as a result, the decisions to go to war or not are based on Iran's decisions and Iran's interests. And you cannot deter them on the local level, thinking that they have local interests that they value so highly that they will be deterred. And that's why I believe this will expand.
Okay, so before I will ask my last question, first of all, I would like to invite our guests to add questions to the Q&A section in the bottom of the screen. And my last question to you, David, is about the UK. So we saw the Prime Minister visiting Israel today. We know what is usually the sentiment in the UK towards Israel. There is a gap between, I believe, the stance of the current government and maybe the atmosphere in the general public. We saw a very unique sight last weekend with a massive rally supporting the Palestinians in the streets of central London. And my question to you is, what do you think will be or should be the role that the UK will play in this new Middle East crisis?
Good question. Look, this war, I think, primarily should be fought by Israel because Israel is the one that was shown to be weak. And any foreign assistance in the war of any significant military way, namely fine with, again, the Patriots, fine with maybe even commanders, certainly fine with net weapons and supplies and stuff like that. But actual direct combat intervention would confirm the weakness of Israel because the Iranians would very quickly say, you see, the Israelis are no longer able to defend themselves. They rely on foreign forces to defend themselves. That this is strictly an American project, a colonial project, and it's beginning to fray and can't defend itself anymore. So for that reason, I think it should very much be only an Israeli victory in terms of the war that Israel has to fight, which is Hezbollah, Hamas, potentially something against Iran, however expansive the Israelis decide it should be. But that said, this is part of the larger assault by a cluster of nations that challenges the world order, believing that the American era is ending. So this is not something that Britain or the United States can dismiss or sit idly by and say, well, we wish you Israelis well, we like you, we hope you win, we'll do what we can to make you win. But in the end, it's you. This is yours. It's not really our fight. It is the American fight. Again, Israel should fight this part of it itself. But the implications for the United States are immense because this is a reflection on the global position of the United States. And since Britain really is a joined at the hip partner strategically with the United States, it's an alignment that has to come into being. And I think eventually, even with Iran, Iran will act in such a way that it will force the hand of the United States and Britain. But I think it's very important that both in Britain and in the United States, there is an understanding that an Israeli victory, while it's absolute for Israel, necessity, is also an extremely important, if not critical, objective for Great Britain and the United States. First of all, to anchor the global position and reputation of the Western cluster of nations. Two, to stabilize the region. And three, the alliance that was emerging between the Abraham Accords, Saudi Arabia, and Israel is a critical Western interest. It really does change the strategic architecture of the region in a good way. And my belief is that the Saudis and the UAE and Bahrain, even Morocco, they have, of course, concerns with the street because there's sympathy for the Palestinians. It can be unpleasant for regimes. They're worried about the stability of Jordan and Egypt and so forth. But at the same time, for them, it is also critical Israel emerges with a stunning, even traumatically administered victory. Because then Israel's a strong horse, and this region is very tribal in its cultural politics. Tribes need strong horses to align with to survive. They don't have any use for weak, lame mules. So if Israel emerges, the stronger the horse Israel emerges as, the more that solidifies the direction toward peace, which then solidifies the direction toward a strong Western alliance structure in the region that actually is anchored to Israel on the Eastern Mediterranean and links to Europe.
Thank you very much, David. We'll take some questions from our guests. And the first question to you is from Roman. And he's asking, Was withdrawing from Afghanistan in combination with the nuclear Iran deal effectively cause this? Doesn't this create a real risk of a larger war, even a world war?
Well, a world war could happen if the West stays asleep. Israel has now woken up, and I think it's a warning sign for the rest of the West not to be complacent. And a world war could happen if they fall asleep, because you still have a very dangerous war in Ukraine. You do have Iran reaching the threshold slowly of a nuclear weapons capability. You have Pyongyang, North Korea, watching very closely. It has tunnels. It could theoretically do the same thing to South Korea that just happened to Israel. You have Taiwan. Yes, you can see if the verdict of this conflict is that Israel emerges weak, the Western alliance still is asleep as a whole and doesn't understand it as a whole, as a team. We are all in this together, and we are all going to either become strong, awake, and alert and deal with this. If we don't, then it could spread. It will spread more and more and more. And then the stakes go up and up and up. And that's how big wars happen, world wars happen. But on the local level, I do believe Israel is going to do what it needs to do to win decisively and stunningly. So I actually think Israel is contributing now a massive contribution to the West. The verdict is still out until Israel does win, but I think they will. But as far as Afghanistan goes, yes, I think this was part of the unraveling of the image of power of the West. This is part of what signaled that the Pax Americana that has governed the world essentially for 80 years was unraveling. And so, yes, I think it had a direct result. But frankly, the failure here is a Western failure. It's an Israeli failure. This failure has so many components to it that it also has so many fathers. So there's many different pieces to the failure here, to be honest. But that is certainly a part of it.
Thank you, David. Ben is asking, how big of a role will the Abraham Accords partners play in the coming month? And he added another question, what does a strong Israel after this look like? So one question is about the Abraham Accords partners, and the other question is about what is strong Israel after this campaign will look like.
Well, the Abraham Accords partners, if Israel wins a stunning victory, and I do believe that it's almost a foregone conclusion that Israel will have to occupy part, if not all, of Gaza. And that may trigger something very ugly in Judea and Samaria. The Abraham Accord countries can play a very important role in helping reestablish those areas, either under Israeli control or helping establish some sort of an alternative to Israeli occupation. Because the United States, I think, still believes that Abu Mazen can be resurrected and the two-state solution can be put back on track through the Palestinian Authority. But I think the Israelis, they see what happened in Gaza to be a reflection not just of Hamas, but of a deeper conflict that they had thought had been resolved with the Palestinians as a people. They don't have a lot of faith that Abu Mazen, if he were as strong as Hamas, he would not do something like this either. There's a shattering of Israeli confidence that they can safely surrender territory and cede it to a Palestinian leader and not face dangerous security consequences. So for at least a long while, I think Israel will be extremely unlikely to expand the power of the Palestinian Authority to fill the void. And they would much prefer, I think, bringing in more actors into the game, maybe even in managing Jerusalem. This was already before this war. There was a lot of frustration in Israel with the management of the Temple Mount and the way the Jordanians for a reason. I mean, they were reasonable from their point of view because they were under constant threat from Hamas, also seizing from them the mantle of being the guardian of Jerusalem for the Muslim interests. But Jordan was trying to essentially ride the tiger, and it was becoming more and more dangerous, even in Jerusalem. So there were already talks underway of bringing in maybe the UAE and maybe the Morocco or maybe Saudi to help reinforce the position in Jerusalem. So you can see the roles played here by the Abraham Accords. But the most important thing I think the Abraham Accords will do is, if this war ends properly, Israel has Iran on the strategic defensive. If then on top of it all, you see a powerful reliance emerge to Iran's south, it sends a signal to the Iranian people that, first of all, frustration with their government, that they're missing out on it. But Iranian people, in my view, don't need more encouragement to be frustrated with their government. They've already essentially divorced from it. They lack, to some extent, the power. But if the Iranian government is thrown on its back heels, that creates a crisis. That's an image of weakness. And that encourages the Iranian opposition, and it encourages some people within the Iranian regime to essentially save their skin and turn coat. And you could see, when you look back at the 1979 Iranian Revolution, it was really that moment where all of a sudden people who were loyal to the Shah tried to preempt their own demise by saying, no, I'm switching sides. And it's that switch that you can't quite measure and you can't predict very precisely, but that could happen in Tehran. That means the strategic victory has to be extensive. And that raises the question of what architecture in the region. You have the Abraham Accords, you have that, we went through that. There's one area I didn't talk about, Syria. The Syrian regime relies on Hezbollah to survive. It relies on the IRGC to survive. IRGC operates through Hezbollah structures in Syria. If Hezbollah enters war and is devastated and destroyed, it begins to threaten the very existence of the Assad regime in Syria. And the Assad regime in Syria is the strategic anchor of Iran in the entire Levant. Second of all, you already have 750,000 Druze in southern Syria in revolt. And they have actually asked, right now they have the 4th Syrian Division and the 5th Syrian Division surrounding them. They've asked Israel to help them take out the 4th and 5th Division and link up in establishing a corridor with Israel. This is almost 1 million people, Druze, asking to be linked up with the Golan Heights. Again, in the framework of an expanded war in the north, something that wasn't realistic a month ago, Israel initiating a war to do this corridor and link up, suddenly becomes a strategic move that puts Iran in a horrible position. And that can send shockwaves back into Tehran that then can really put the regime on the defensive. And then you add to it the strategic architecture to the south emerging. You can only imagine how dark the world will then look for the mullahs in Tehran.
So just what do you think would be a strong Israel after this look like?
The strong Israel, the country, I think it's inevitable that Israel will have to reoccupy Gaza for a while. I think it will have to make its northern border safe. And as long as Hezbollah stays there, it's not safe. You could have in a year happen what happened in the south happen. So Israel essentially does have to address that problem and resolve that problem now. So I think Israel's going to create a buffer around it that essentially creates a period of peace. Lebanon, it may have to occupy partly and may have an international force. I don't know. Same in Gaza. It will certainly have to reoccupy for a while because the cleaning out will take months. But then maybe an international force, something will arise. I don't know what, but Israel will essentially push these threats away from its border, so it can't happen again. And Iran will be fighting its own internal fights, and it could be strategically in such a difficult position that it loses access, and then you could have the Houthis in trouble with the Saudis, etc. So I think you could really bring about a very a very big change. And then internally in Israel, Israel was torn to shreds over the last half year. And the one thing I really have to say, I'm sensing the first 6 days in Israel after the attack was a period of mourning and shock. I mean, it really was taking stock, and people were horrified and sad. And then it started turning. And the first thing I started sensing was a slight sense of optimism emerging. They're still awfully terribly sad about the hostages and all the death, and we're still finding victims. But there is a sense of, okay, we messed up. I mean, we did the Jewish thing and we killed each other proverbially, and the enemy came and they nearly destroyed us. The Romans did it. We almost, sinat chinam, we learned our lesson. So now, obviously, so much in this country was damaged and was not working, whether it's the top level of the military, whether it's the government, whether it's the chattering classes on TV, whether it's the Oslo crowd, whether it's the opposition. There's, I think, a universal view that all of you were responsible for pushing this too far and causing so much internal tension that brought about a disaster. And frankly, not delivering the country the sort of performance that was due the country, as really they were on a trajectory a decade to have. So I think there's a sense emerging in Israel of rebirth afterwards. Namely, enough with these fights. Yeah, we're going to go back to the Jewish national sport of tearing each other to shreds. But first, right now, we're unified, and we're going to come out of this war unified. And we're going to leverage that unity to try to fix a lot of these problems that led us into this and led us into what happened in the half year before it and led us into so many different things. So I'm sensing a degree of optimism of a national rebirth. It's not quite the same as 73. And the whole war will go that way. I mean, it started as 73. It sort of proceeded as 48, where Israelis were fighting in the streets. But if it ends like 67, a massive strategic victory, I think that converges with this Israeli sense that I'm sensing the beginnings of optimism. You really could see this emerging in a much stronger, is basically Israel taken to the next level.
There is a question here about the hostages. And is there any chance of the hostages being rescued from Hamas, in your opinion?
Well, yeah, I think some might be able to be rescued. I'm sure the Israeli structures, the American structures, German structures, there's 50 nations practically that have hostages. A good 10 or 15 of them are so close, like-minded, that they can share all intelligence and cooperate. And my understanding is there is a presence here of those nations that will help if hostages are located, that they may be able to do something. So I'm sorry, I'm getting all these things on my thing about things happening around. Anyway, they're here, and so you could see rescue attempts if the intelligence is there. And as I said, you have 10, 15 intelligence agencies pooling all their information together. You could theoretically see that. That said, however, this is horrible. They're suffering, these hostages. We know what Hamas is capable of. The inhuman depravity. You had an Irish father whose child was killed, a 6-year-old girl. And when he found out that his daughter was among the dead and not taken hostage, he broke out in relief. He cried out of relief because for him, the greatest horror was that she would be held hostage. And that's a horrible feeling to have, but there is a real horror here. I think for Israel to take Gaza and liberate it is probably the best bet for releasing as many of the hostages as you can. Unfortunately, many may not survive it, but the life that they will live in captivity by Hamas for the next 5-10 years, which is the alternative. If that doesn't happen, if there's no rescue attempts or reoccupation, I think are just ghastly.
We discussed it already, but just maybe there is a question here asking you maybe to emphasize, what did Hamas aim to achieve with this suicide, as you described it?
I think they understood that by delivering a major strategic victory to the region, to the Iranian axis, and humiliating Israel and weakening Israel and making the image of Israel as a lame mule rather than a strong horse, it would so weaken Israel that one, Hamas may lose its position in Gaza. But you even had a Hamas leader say after day 2 of this war, he said, "I salute us." He's in Gaza. He's saying, "I salute us for this great victory in Gaza, but we must remember that Gaza is the sideshow. Jerusalem, the West Bank, and Israel itself is the real game." And I think that's also the Iranian view, which is, as great as it is that Gaza is Hamas, and as great as it is that Hamas has delivered a victory, that's not what matters. What matters is Israel's weak, Israel is falling to pieces, the image of Israel is going down, the Palestinians in the West Bank feel strength and encouragement and exhilaration from Hamas's victory, and they become Hamas. And the region, the Arabs across the region feel pride and exhilaration from this awful thing for us, but great for them. And that this turns the tide on Jordan, this turns the tide on Egypt, this turns the tide against Israel, may even turn the tide on Saudi Arabia and Morocco. And with that sort of a tidal wave, and that's why I think it's called the Al-Aqsa flood, and that's the way the Hamas has called this, the Al-Aqsa flood war, because literally it's like a flood that they're trying to create, and flood is the stream of water, direction, strategic momentum. So I think that's how you understand strategically what Hamas was trying to do. It understands locally in Gaza isn't the game anymore. It needed to do something that takes it to the different level.
2 last questions. The first question is, how likely do you think the West are to once again put pressure on Israel to stop and dissuade them from winning the war?
But the pressure will be there with casualties. Gaza's urban warfare. It's going to be ugly. I have to run. We've got a
okay.
Yeah.
Please bear with us a few minutes. Hopefully David will come back and we will answer the last 2 questions. Thank you for your patience, but that's the reality right now.
Okay, we're good. Sorry about that.
Are you okay, David?
Yeah, we're all okay.
Okay, we had a commercial break about Stand With Us, so you know.
That's good.
Okay, so you just answered the question about will the West will try to prevent Israel from winning? So
yeah, will the West? So I think they're going to try to, when you start seeing casualties and so forth, they're going to say, "Oh, we have to calm this down." But in many ways, there is a convergence of interests here on Hamas. So I think the Americans are going to give Israel quite a bit of room to deal with Gaza. So it's not quite like before, for different reasons. I mean, it's not a reason Israel really would want to destroy Hamas, to bring in Abu Mazen. But at any rate, that I think is why I think the United States will probably give Israel a bit more room than normal.
Okay, there is another question. Do you think Israel will provide work visas after the war, knowing that Gazans with work visas took part in the massacre?
I think a lot of things are going to change, and this includes from the West Bank. Things are going to change quite a bit. The assumption was, I mean, remember, the work visas were also a function of two things. One is, you need to economically develop Gaza so that they have a vested interest in maintaining order. In other words, deterrence. That you give them something to lose, then obviously they're not going to want to lose it. But that fell apart. So first of all, you have directly a consequence of the collapse of deterrence. One of the main reasons why the Israelis felt responsible for economic development in Gaza are out the window. And frankly, in the West Bank too, this is going to have an effect. But then the second thing is, yes, these workers turned out. I don't know if they intended to. Well, I know they intended to, but whether they really wanted to do it or not is a different question, because they can be threatened by Hamas. But the bottom line is they provided extremely detailed intelligence information down to the level of where the rooms in each house are, where the kids sleep, how many dogs are in this house, how many, I mean, unbelievably detailed intelligence that made this whole invasion possible. So Israel has learned its lesson. It cannot trust this, and it cannot trust workers coming in. So I think the long-term consequences of this still are unfolding, but the fundamental attitudes of Israel toward the Palestinians has changed. And that's going to be something that will change.
Okay. So look, we cannot avoid politics. So the last question to you is, do you think Netanyahu will survive this post-war? And I want to add, maybe in a more broad perspective, what do you think the effects will be also on the top generals of the Israeli military, on the IDF, which were part of this, failure?
Golda Meir didn't survive politically, even though she wasn't really responsible. I believe that the prime minister, whether he realizes it or not, I don't know, his legacy will be written in the next 3-4 weeks. His entire career boils down to the next 3-4 weeks. This is it. This is his last chapter. I don't believe politically he can, and from hearing from people who are very close to him, should go for another term. The government may last a while, but this is it. I think he will. This is the end of his political career. He was the chief of the ship, and the ship had a catastrophe. And the captain takes responsibility. Even if he doesn't take responsibility, it will be thrown on him.
And about the IDF?
The IDF, I think the top levels of the military, all of them. And more than that, the whole conceptualization of the military will change. In 1973, a concept or conceptia collapsed. What you see now with the IDF is a whole parade of concepts have collapsed. The entire way the IDF organized itself, tactically, weapons-wise, strategically, foreign relations-wise, everything collapsed. Everything collapsed. Technology, everything collapsed. So basically, it needs a fresh start, and you need a new top level for that. The soldiers on the ground proved themselves once again. They saved the country through their bravery and fighting to the death in those first kilometers in the Gaza envelope. But the top level really is going to face consequences for this. But I would, I hear some people on the left, so I say this about the right, and Netanyahu is going to pay a price for this, and probably ought to. The far right should pay a price for this, because the reform really did tear apart the country to some extent. But the left bears a very heavy responsibility too, and I think you're going to see a lot of indictment, not legal, but political indictment of these of the left, because they crossed red lines in their protests toward the reforms, very strong red lines. But more than that, one can't get around the fact that this is ultimately a consequence of disengagement in Oslo. And you can't maintain that paradigm and say this is all Netanyahu's fault when the process that led to this began then. And was predicted, by the way, by those who opposed disengagement and Oslo. So I think what you're seeing is the beginning of what will be a massive political upheaval. New players, new actors, new formations, a whole change in politics. Usually is a two-step process. You have the destroyers and the builders. So first come those who wreck the system, and then come those who build. But I do think that you're going to see in Israel an emergence of a new elite, a new politics, a whole new system. And you're also going to see a new military leadership arise. And it's going to affect elites of the chattering class, everybody. I think what you're going to see is a complete churning and effervescence in who is the elite. And Israel will be a very different place in a year or two. Very different place. But everybody will be held to account. I'm sure. I mean, nobody's going to go to jail. Israel's it's just not that sort of a place. But people will be held to account. And Bibi, I think this is it. He can redeem himself by waging this war properly in the next 2 to 3, 4, 5 weeks. That'll be how he'll be judged.
So before I will thank you, David, I just would like to answer 2 questions that I think that they are more relevant to me. First of all, people ask if there are rallies or protests. So I just saw that on Saturday there is a rally to support releasing the hostages held by the JLC, the Board of Deputies, and UJIA. So I guess that some of you got this invitation as well. In terms of the question of how can you help us, so we need you. We have a special email address, uk@standwithus.com. We are looking for volunteers in almost every area. So write to us. You will find a form in our website that is more specific, and you can also add what exactly are you looking to do, and we will get back to you. So obviously the demand is overwhelmed. We need you. Help us, volunteer with us. We need you, and stand with us. David, I know that you're busy these days, and I thank you very much for taking the time for share with us your incredible insights about the region. As you said, we worked in the past, and your wisdom is something that always amazed me. Thank you very much for sharing with us your thoughts. We appreciate it. I wish you all good night, and join us next Thursday, same hour, 8 o'clock, with Miri Eisen. We will talk a bit about Israel and the Hasbara, which it's a quite complicated topic for Israelis and for Israel in general. So we're looking forward to see you next week. Thank you very much, and good night.